All right. Should we admit everybody?
You can admit everybody. I'm going to wait a few minutes until we get some bigger numbers though.
Okay.
Okay. Welcome everyone. We're at 3:59. I'm going to give folks a minute or two to log in. Looks like so far we have about 30 participants and we had over 200 people register. So I want to make sure we have a quorum before we get started. So thanks everyone for being on time. All right, great. So it's 4:01. I'm going to get us started. I know people are going to be joining over the next few minutes, but we do have a packed agenda, so I'm going to get us started. I want to start with a huge welcome. Welcome to everyone who's able to join us today. This is our fourth in a series of COVID-19 research community forums. I've been delighted to work with my colleagues across the state of our 4 Massachusetts CTSI programs to host this community forum series. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Tracy Battaglia. I am a primary care physician at Boston Medical Center and Boston University and a clinician investigator. I'm gonna start by sharing my real huge excitement that so many of you are able to join us and appreciate you for being here and attending. I think we can all share in an understanding of the tremendous uncertainty that the COVID pandemic has brought to us in our personal and professional lives. And so with my colleagues from across the CTSAs across Massachusetts, this forum was really born with the explicit goal of engaging a diverse group of stakeholders in a conversation about research related to COVID-19. Representing the CTSA programs in translational science, I don't think that anything other than a pandemic like this can really highlight the importance of translational science and translational research in addressing the health of our public. And so now more than ever, we have to capitalize on all of our resources and collaborate and share knowledge. And so that's what this community forum is all about. So I'm gonna take a brief minute, hopefully. Advance my slides, review the agenda. I'm gonna introduce you, walk you through sort of what we've done with the community forums to date. I'll introduce you to our speaker. The majority of our time will be spent by hearing from our speaker today, Dr. Ben Linas. And then we're gonna hopefully have about 15 minutes for an open discussion. And then we'll wrap up and talk about next steps. Just some housekeeping information. We are recording this session. We ask you to keep your cameras off and mute your microphones just to sort of make sure we have good bandwidth on the call. Please, during the presentation, use your chat box to pose questions to the speaker. We're not going to interrupt Dr. Linas during his talk, though. We're going to answer all the questions at the end of the presentation. If we're not able to get to all the answers, we will be posting the responses to the questions on our CTSI website. We'll make sure we make that accessible to all of our participants today. So this is, as I said, the fourth in a series of forums. Our first series was hosted about a month ago already by our Tufts colleagues. Josh Cohen spoke to us about quantitative modeling and the role that it plays in helping us allocate resource and plan our resources in light of the COVID epidemic in real time. The second week was hosted by our colleagues from UMass. We heard about RNA therapeutics in terms of investigational drugs from Dr. Anastasia Kurova. And then just last week, our colleagues from the Harvard Catalyst hosted a discussion by Dr. Jonathan Grad about really thinking about post-pandemic immunity and vaccinations. And to round out our discussion, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker from Boston Medical Center, Boston University, Dr. Ben Linas. His talk is entitled Building a Research Infrastructure for Equity in COVID-19 Treatment. I'm sure we're all quite well aware of the stark disparities that we're starting to see and understand about the COVID pandemic, and ensuring access to COVID-related research for our most vulnerable populations is an important topic. It's something that we've talked about in each of the prior community forums, and it's the topic of the discussion that Dr. Linas is going to talk us through now. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Linas. He's an infectious disease specialist. He has a national reputation for research in co-infection of hepatitis C and HIV, and has experience with multiple forms of research, including computational biology, clinical epi, and clinical economics. And so he's been really spearheading with a number of other leaders across Boston Medical Center and Boston University in thinking about how do we ensure access to COVID-related research for the most vulnerable populations. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Ben, and invite you to share yours.
Terrific. All right. Go to presentation mode, 1 second. Okay. Well, thanks for the introduction. Hi, my name is Ben Linas, and that was a nice intro. In my sort of pre-COVID life, I actually do simulation modeling. And so, right, that thing around COVID modeling in real time sounds right up my wheelhouse. And I actually collaborate with Jonathan Grad on non-COVID related research. So this is a different type of talk for me, and really sort of reflects the fact that, like many of us, I'm sure on the call, like our lives very much, our academic lives very much pivoted in March. And so while I'm still engaged in all of that work around substance use and infectious complications, COVID research has really become a big part of my life these days. This talk is really, it's somewhat of a narrative, sort of a story of what happened over the last 2 months at BMC and how we've responded. Looking up now that it's May, realizing that really what we're doing is building a research infrastructure for equity in COVID-19 treatment. So as you know, a brief introduction, I think everybody knows this and has seen the fact that COVID-19 does not affect all people equally, and that there have been data coming out from multiple locations around the country showing that people of color, and especially African-American people, are highly overrepresented in COVID cases and COVID deaths. This is data that was compiled by Forbes magazine that just puts in one graph reports from various settings like Louisiana, Illinois, Michigan, North Carolina, and Chicago. And you can see that almost without exception, African Americans are overrepresented in COVID deaths compared to their share of the total population of the state or the city. Unfortunately, Boston is not an exemption to this. So this is a map of Boston, and the color of each of these neighborhoods represents the relative prevalence of COVID, where the light color is lower than average, the medium color is about average, and the dark color is higher than average. And I think for those who live in Boston can appreciate that these cities of neighborhoods of Hyde Park and Mattapan, Dorchester are areas that historically have been the place where people of color and people who were born overseas and people who don't speak English live. This is the same map now on the left. It might be hard to appreciate this little yellow dot with the blue circle around it. That's meant to represent BMC. That's roughly where we are located in Boston. And on the right, there is a map that shows you where the patients who get their care at BMC live. And the size of the red circle indicates the relative contribution of that neighborhood to the BMC population. And I think just by eyeballing the map on the left to the map on the right, it's pretty clear that the patients that come to BMC also live in the neighborhoods that are heavily impacted by COVID-19. So now I want to go back in time just a little bit, although in the COVID times, going all the way back to March 10th is like going back to a different world. It feels like about a year ago. So if you look back, these are some headlines that I pulled out of the news from March 10th, 2020. Remember, there is a primary season going on, and that was actually still happening in live voting back then in March. But COVID was in the news, right? Economy faces tornado-like headwind as financial markets spiral, confusion over coronavirus, quarantines feed anxiety. Oil prices were becoming an issue. Italy was in the middle of the surge of its pandemic. And we were just starting to get the bad and scary news about the spread of COVID through nursing facilities, in this case in Seattle, because Seattle was just starting to peak. This is where we were in Massachusetts. I actually couldn't get it to go all the way back to March 10th. March 12th is the very beginning of this sort of Google Analytics COVID tracker that everyone can look at now on Google. So as of March 12th, 2020 in Massachusetts, we had a reported 13 cases. So it's hard to imagine, but back then we were just at the very beginning of what was to come. And really at that point, we saw what was coming based on the news and based on what was happening in Seattle. And I think everyone around the country was getting ready for the fact that this pandemic is real and it's really going to sweep over us. And we realized at BMC and elsewhere that at that time and still at this time, there were no FDA-approved treatments for this infection. And we really were left without options. And so we made an initial attempt, along with others, to collaborate with industry sponsors who had compounds, either novel compounds or compounds that had been used for other diseases that have an FDA indication, but not for COVID-19. And so we reached out to them. We have a history at BMC of running successfully HIV and Hep C trials, as well as oncology trials, many times with the same companies that were sponsoring clinical trials of COVID therapies. So several of our faculty and staff went out and contacted associates of pharmaceutical firms that were opening these first wave of COVID RCTs. We applied for site status. We sort of did our pitch for 5 first wave clinical trials. But unfortunately, we were not awarded a site for any of the first wave COVID randomized controlled trials. And it was frustrating because we felt like we were one of the only hospitals, or certainly one of the only academic medical centers in Boston, that wasn't getting access to these trials. And actually really there's been multiple times over the last couple of months where all of us, I think, have had to pause and look at what we're doing and have difficult conversations around ethics and what are we doing and what is the right response now. And this was a moment to think about research and how research relates to clinical care and what is the proper role of a randomized controlled trial in providing COVID care. Because there is, I think most people know, sort of at the core of clinical trial ethics is this concept that the end of a clinical trial is not treating trial participants, but rather it's producing generalizable medical knowledge, right? And there's an entire career of medical ethics thinking about this and what does it mean to enroll a person into a controlled trial if really that person doesn't stand to benefit, and the real goal here is to help people in the future. So we knew that. But at the same time, recognize that COVID-19 mortality is very high, especially if you're already in the hospital, and there really is no FDA-approved treatment. And when there are no therapies available and the mortality risk is high, access to trials does in some respect represent access to therapy. This is not the first time that people have had these thoughts, right? This difficult ethical scenario characterized the Ebola outbreak in Africa, and so people have thought about this. But it becomes clear that when there are no therapies, trials might be taking on a role other than their traditional role as providing generalizable knowledge, and to some extent they might provide a safe way to provide new therapies. This blurred line between research and treatment, I've come to realize, is actually not just us, right? So this is on the left. The Infectious Diseases Society of America put out guidelines in April on the treatment and management of patients with COVID-19. And I underline the word here, IDSA guidance for the treatment of COVID-19 on April 11th. So these are 7 of the recommendations. And my point here is not to go through all of them, but effectively they're listing potential compounds to treat COVID-19. And you can see only in the context of a clinical trial, only in the context of a clinical trial. And I would point out, again, these are the guidelines for treatment, and yet we're talking about clinical trials. And so it actually dawned on me as we were writing this talk, because I've spoken a lot to colleagues and mentors who are at IDSA about this recommendation and what it means for sites that don't have clinical trials. And it dawned on me that actually the IDSA guidelines themselves are blurring this line, because the line is blurry. When there are no treatments, the clinical trials do represent access to care. So I really came to realize that insisting that clinical trials are categorically distinct from clinical therapy is really an argument made from a position of privilege. For those who have the infection and those who have no access to trials, clinical trials represent some hope for effective treatment. And I would postulate here that some access to hope is important, even if in the end it turns out that that is a compound that doesn't work and the hope was misplaced. I think that most people coming into the hospital would rather have the choice of engaging than not have the choice of engaging, even if they know that eventually perhaps this compound won't work. And so in this case, access to trials really does determine access to potential therapy. And I'd point out that that tension is reflected really in the clinical guidelines themselves. So that made us start to wonder, well, what hospitals do have access to COVID-19 randomized controlled trials? We know our situation in Boston, but perhaps it's, we're seeing it through the lens of our own struggle, and maybe this is just us. So working with some colleagues, a couple of fellows in nephrology who are actually at the Brigham, one of whom is going to come join us on faculty at BMC, and others, we decided to do a very quick look. We went to clinicaltrials.gov, which I think most people are aware of, and it lists all registered COVID-19 trials in the United States. And it's possible to drill down not just to where the sort of parent prime site is, but all of the research sites. Ashish Verma, who's the fellow, had a very clever idea, which is to go to America's Essential Hospitals, which is an advocacy group for safety net hospitals in the US. Safety net hospitals are hospitals that care for a large proportion of patients who are uninsured or who are on public insurance, traditionally a high proportion of people of color and people who don't speak English. And so really we identified the research sites for every COVID-19 RCT that was registered on clinicaltrials.gov, and we crossed that list with the list of safety net hospitals in America. And it's not fancy data, but this is what we found. So this is a straight up simple bar graph. On the left, it's showing you the percent of hospitals in America. The blue are non-safety net hospitals, and the orange that I offset are safety net hospitals, right? So the cumulative percentage is 100. 33% of the hospitals in America are categorized as safety net or America's Essential Hospitals. If instead you look at the allocation of industry-funded COVID-19 randomized controlled trials, really only 18% of the sites were safety net hospitals. So it's easy to see at sort of this very high level that safety net hospitals are definitely substantially underrepresented in the hospitals that are doing COVID-19 randomized controlled trials at this time. So we came to realize, this disparity in RCT allocation is actually becoming a disparity in treatment. It's true that we don't know that any of these treatments are effective, but some hospitals have clinical trials for multiple classes of drug and even multiple compounds within the same class of drug. And some hospitals have no clinical trials. And so clinical trials are playing a major role in providing therapy for COVID-19, and the care that patients receive is going to depend on the hospital to which they present. Now, in some ways, when I wrote that last bullet, I felt a little naive, as if the care people receive doesn't always depend on the hospital to which they present. But in this case, it seemed particularly in your face that really there are some hospitals that can't offer anything right now, and there are others that have this abundance of trials, and that's problematic. So that led me really to wonder, how can this happen? And over the last 6 weeks, 8 weeks, it's really become clear to me that COVID's not really revealing anything new in our society. It's probably naive to wonder how does this happen. But what COVID does do, and it's been upsetting and also important to recognize, that really what COVID's doing is accelerating the pace at which disparities manifest themselves in outcomes. Many of the disparities that we're talking about now have existed for a very long time. But COVID is just so acute and the deterioration is so fast that it does not take long to identify the disparity in exposure that results in a bad outcome 4 days later, right? We don't need to wait around 25 years to see the bad outcomes resulting in disparities from diabetes. So this story about controlled trials at BMC really is an important story, and I think an illustrative story of structural bias. And in my experience, it was the most, I'm going to tell the story, it was the most well encapsulated and clear example that I've personally been involved with. So on April 11th, 2020, I actually had the privilege of speaking to a colleague who's the vice president at a major pharmaceutical firm who was involved in selecting COVID-19 trial sites. And we talked about this. And this is a person who I know had no intention of creating disparities in allocating trial sites, and is a person who thinks about this and is upset to see that it's true. And so we were talking, and when the epidemic began, pharmaceutical firms looked around, they saw the surge just as the rest of us did at roughly the same time, and came to realize, goodness, this is actually going to be an epidemic in the United States that's going to sweep across the country, and we have to be available to open these trials quickly. And so to their credit, it's actually quite remarkable how quickly companies were able to stand up these trials or initiate these trials. You know, a process that often takes months or even a year was happening in a matter of days or weeks. But expediency was a major criterion, and a major criterion in thinking about how to select a site. And so there were a couple of criteria that they use that are certainly face valid for site selection. One was who has the most cases, and the other was, well, where is there a track record of success? Who have we worked with before? Because this is a high stakes game and we don't really have time to start from scratch. We want to work with people who we know can successfully conduct trials and get this done. So the first thing I wanted to think about was, well, how are case counts biased? Because that certainly seems like a on the face neutral and rational way to decide where to allocate a clinical trial. So for that, I want to take us back again to March 10th, 2020. So remember this, shortages of crucial chemicals creates new obstacles to US coronavirus testing. I think it's hard to forget because we're still living with the legacy of this botched rollout of testing, and we're not where we need to be even today. But think back to March 10th, that was when really testing was a scarce resource. And it turned out at that point, testing was a very limited resource, and it was not equally distributed at that time. Some hospitals had more testing and some hospitals had less. And hospitals that did more testing had more cases because they found cases when they tested. And those that did less testing had fewer cases because they did less testing. Within a week of learning that we would not be a site for first wave randomized controlled trials, we had the highest per capita COVID rate in Boston, per bed rate in Boston. But at the time, there were disparities in testing availability, and that led to it looking like there were different case counts at different hospitals. How's a track record of success biased? I think that most people can probably foresee how this might be a biased metric, but really in this there was a problematic use of the social network, right? In this context, being awarded site status for a COVID-19 randomized controlled trial is an extremely valuable commodity. Whenever anyone relies too heavily on social networks to make allocation decisions, those decisions are always prone to bias. We know that in school admissions, in jobs, in loans, right? If you have something valuable and you just rely on your social network to distribute it, you'll almost always end up with a biased result because you end up just talking to the same people over and over again. And that's exactly what happened here. Understandably, companies relied on their social networks in order to get trials going quickly. Unfortunately, that resulted in a biased outcome. So what is structural bias? Structural bias, it's a tendency for the procedures and practices of institutions to operate in ways which result in certain social groups being advantaged or favored and others being disadvantaged or devalued. And I think this little story of what happened with COVID controlled trials at the very beginning is a really well characterized and shining example of what structural bias looks like. Because I honestly believe that there is no one involved in that process who wanted to develop this kind of disparity. And I think that almost all the people in that process would actually take steps to avoid it if they could. But these structural biases resulted in a biased outcome. It probably shouldn't be surprising, right? Structural bias is all around us all the time, but here it is. It's striking, like I said, how COVID-19 makes that bias clear. But we really, I would propose going forward, can't allow business as usual to continue. But first, it's more in our COVID research. It's morally wrong. It's actually bad for the science. It results in non-generalizable findings. It's bad for clinical outcomes because it leads to disparities in care. And it's bad for public health because it means that we're not going to have full knowledge that we need in order to develop effective interventions to control and end the epidemic. So our response has been to build the infrastructure for research equity. So these are several of my colleagues at BU Medical Center and BMC: Tahina Nioji, Michael Pashorlo, Nina Lin, Manish Sagar, Bhavesh Shah, and Vaishali Sanchawala, who have together rededicated themselves and went back out to speak to sponsors and advocate for trials. And they've been successful. They've brought sponsors back to the table. At the same time, the BU CTSI made a remarkable commitment of study staff and coordinator time to clinical trials and to research. And we now, I want to be careful, I think it's about 5 full-time equivalents of personnel time were effectively donated to this cause to get this work going. Also, the hospital made really a historic commitment to doing clinical trials and doing research in the hospital space in terms of the clinical trials office, pharmacy time, phlebotomy time, nursing. I could go on. Making these lists makes me nervous that I'm leaving somebody else out, some department or some person out. But I do think it's worth pausing one more time to, it was inspiring, the degree to which our institution put down the typical kind of concerns that people have when they enter new collaboration or enter new research, and instead took an attitude of, this needs to happen now. What can we do to help? And it's quite things that were deemed not possible 6 months ago happened in 48 hours as we were setting up this research infrastructure. And the nice thing is that we now do have controlled trials at BMC. So after all of this work, it's now really only been, where are we now? May 14th. So a little, about 6 weeks. We now have 6 open clinical trials for COVID, with 2 more opening next week. We have trials in inpatient settings and ambulatory settings. We have trials for early, moderate, and severe disease. We have trials with multiple classes of medications, including immune modulatory agents and antiviral compounds. So it really has been a toil. We've worked very hard, and those protocol PIs are really donating effectively their entire life to getting this work done right now. But it's been successful when we got the trials open. And what's been really rewarding and exciting to see is that seeking that equity and building that infrastructure has also led to a real burst of science across the medical campus. So if you think about it, that randomized controlled trial platform is a process for screening, approaching, and consenting participants. The platform provides a system for routine assessment of clinical status in labs. A platform for, the RCT platform requires updates to the electronic health record for research purposes, as well as an active culture of research in the hospital. And all of those assets are generalizable to all human subjects research at BMC, not only randomized controlled trials. And in fact, we are leveraging that infrastructure to do more work. So we've put together what we're calling the BUMC COVID-19 research response. And this is a draft mission statement that I've put together that says that our research response provides BMC patients access to randomized controlled trials of leading candidate treatments for COVID-19. And we seek to ensure that scientific inquiry into COVID-19 includes data and specimens from people of color, non-English speaking persons, and persons born outside of the United States. And we've been doing a lot of work on this front. So one thing that we're putting together now is what we're calling a discarded specimens repository. This is being led by my colleagues Steve Pelton and Rotem Lapidot from the actually pediatric infectious diseases. The discarded specimens repository is using clinical specimens that were collected early in the epidemic for clinical purposes and have been stuck in a freezer now waiting. They include things like NP swabs, viral transport medium, urine, and maybe some CSF, but it had to be collected clinically. That it's available for research. We're putting together a transparent and fair process for a steering committee such that if BUMC investigators and even investigators from around town who are interested can approach the steering committee seeking access. There's a review process to prioritize when aliquots are limited, et cetera. And this is meant to be a platform for all forms of research across the entire institution. At the same time, we're actually also building a prospective specimens repository. So this is being led by Nina Lin and Karen Jacobson on the bottom left, and Tracy Battaglia, who's there sort of in the middle, colleagues and friends of mine who are working to build a traditional prospective enrollment specimens repository for patients coming into the hospital with COVID-19. They will be doing prospective and longitudinal collection of NP swabs, blood, urine, stool, and rectal swabs. I think it's actually grown, and there might be tongue scrapings there now as well, but don't hold me to it. And this is actually in a collaboration more broadly across town, and collaborating with the Massachusetts Consortium on Pathogen Readiness, or Mass CPR, which has been really rewarding because we're now contributing to something larger even than just our own institution, and excited to be working with colleagues and friends at Harvard and at Tufts who are thinking about, you know, all forms of studies that might be using these specimens, from the molecular all the way up to public health. And the third thing we're building is an electronic health records cohort. So this is going to be an outcomes cohort based on the electronic health record. It's being led by Heather Hsu, who's there in the bottom right, with mentoring from Karen Jacobson. And this will be, I mean, people know what a EHR cohort looks like: regular updates from clinical data warehouse, a data frame to map to the REDCap database. It's going to be linkable to specimen repositories so that it's possible to link, right, your clinical research specimen to the outcomes that were associated with it. It has lab values and pharmacy data. Vital signs is recorded in Epic. It looks like an EHR cohort. So we're really excited about that. And Heather's been doing a remarkable job of, I would say, modernizing the way that we're pulling data out of our clinical data warehouse now. This is a schema for what this will look like. It's actually the prospective specimen repository. I don't want to jinx it. It's due to open imminently. And you can see there'll be linkages from the EHR database back to the prospective specimen repository and also to the discarded specimens repository. Theoretically, I suppose there could be an arrow between discarded specimens and prospective, but I think that will be vanishingly rare, because it's really the handful of people who perhaps have a discarded specimen and then got enrolled in the prospective specimens cohort that would need that. So we've certainly experienced challenges in doing this. Some of the challenges are due to COVID. COVID-19 is a very difficult disease, and it's very hard to do clinical trials research or any kind of research in this setting. The time course from hospitalization to clinical deterioration can be very fast. Patients are often anxious, they're unable to focus with acute illness, which makes it difficult to approach them about research, much less consent them. Families can't be present for informed consent, which makes all of that process more complicated technically and requires a conference call and bringing in a third person who often doesn't answer the phone, you can imagine. And, you know, I didn't appreciate this, but it comes down to the mundane. Oxygen therapy is loud. Right? And because it's loud, it makes it difficult to have a phone call into the room to do remote consenting of a patient. So some of these very, very in the weeds details have a huge impact on your ability to enroll participants in this work. Some of the challenges we've experienced have also been results of doing research with vulnerable populations. So many of our patients are not aware of what a clinical trial is. Right? And so our discussion with them of would you like to engage in research begins with what is a clinical trial. Some of our patients are deeply suspicious of research and researchers off the bat, and we need to approach a lot of patients in order to enroll one subject or participant. I think that the ratio that Vaishali was saying the other day was she needs to approach about 20 potential participants in order to enroll one. Some of that's because they screen out by inclusions and exclusions, but some of it is also because of the suspiciousness of research. And many of our patients do not speak English, and they need an interpreter. The need for interpreter services makes consent still more challenging. So, you know, it's not always easy to do research in populations that aren't used to doing research, and that's the path that we're trying to forge. But I'm happy to report we've also had some really rewarding successes. This was a point of pride for me. The very first patient that we enrolled in a trial at BMC was a non-English speaker. The first person, and that person was the first non-English speaker in the entire study. So it really was one of those moments of, see, we told you so. This is important. If you don't include us in your work, you won't end up with this population. And literally the first person we approached, that was the case. And then that same study was the second leading national enroller last week in the entire study. So it's not just that we're enrolling populations that are underrepresented, but I'm really proud of our protocol leads that we're actually leading in just generally conducting this research. The CDC is now using our electronic health records cohort and gave Heather feedback that they were impressed that it's really amongst the best data they've seen coming out of public hospitals nationally. And she's writing now an MMWR report based on our CDW, our electronic health records cohort. And we've really started employing this research infrastructure for the very first time. We have better use of Epic now for research than we've ever had before. We have e-consent standard operating procedures and technology that we've never had before. Video communications are coming forward. I think that a lot of us have experienced some of this, that COVID has forced technological solutions that now we hope won't go away when COVID is over. But it's really, I was on service at BMC last week, and it was a really rewarding experience for me to just rounding in the hospital. The excitement around research and the commitment to doing research was palpable in a way that it hadn't been before. And coming from everywhere, coming from health officers, nurses, and even patients. I think it's partly because of the desperate situation and the pressure of the epidemic is leading to that enthusiasm, but it's really great to see that sort of coming to fruition and seeing the hospital being a real world-class research institution. So in conclusion, COVID-19 increases the pace at which long-term structural disparities manifest as disparate outcomes. The allocation of research trials is an example of structural bias, but BUMC is committed to changing that business as usual. Oops, there we go. So our mission now is to contribute to world-class specimens, data, and experiments to advance knowledge of SARS-CoV-2, the virus itself, and COVID-19 disease. But we want to ensure that all people contribute to our knowledge base and that the insights we make are generalizable. We see no distinction in our mission goals of advancing science and reducing disparity, because there is no good science that includes disparity. And we're really eager to collaborate. We're seeking collaboration with others around Massachusetts and the country. As I mentioned, we're working with the Mass Consortium on Pathogenicin Readiness, and we hope to be working with you too, and look forward to hearing ideas and discussing work going forward into the future. And that's the end of my formal presentation. Thank you.
Ben, that was amazing. Thank you so much. First of all, I want to commend you on being perfectly on time. So thank you.
Okay.
You've left us ample time for discussion and questions. So I'm going to, as the host, I'm going to use the platform to sort of ask the first question, and it'll give our participants an opportunity to put their questions in the chat, which I'll pull off questions for you in a moment. But I just want to first, thank you so much for an amazing talk. What a silver lining and what a great story this is in, a really sort of uncertain times where things could have gotten worse, and the leadership that you and others across the institution took to ensure that this wasn't just business as usual is really remarkable. And I want to acknowledge, I should have acknowledged at the beginning, that not only were you doing all this work behind the scenes to get access to research, but you, among many of the people you mentioned in your talk, are also on the front lines and sort of providing care and creating the protocols for delivering care for our patients. So you should be acknowledged for that too.
Thank you very much.
So I really appreciate the acknowledgement that you made about all the people who put resources on the table, the faculty who are sort of, putting all their efforts, BMC and sort of putting resources, the CTSI and putting resources. And really what happened was the inertia that's normally there was sort of just went away because of sort of the unprecedented circumstances. And I wonder, since this is a forum for translational science across the CTSI programs, can you comment on how do we take this model and really bring it across the CTSI programs? You may have not mentioned, but like, how do we collaborate with our other academic institutions to sort of really sort of continue to move this work forward? Because we don't want it to be unique to BMC and BU, right? We want to sort of expand across the CTSI. So can you comment, or you have thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, I think one thing that we have an eye on that for sure is in trying to build these both data and specimen repositories to be collaborating broadly around the CTSIs in the area. Right now, it's Boston, it's the Massachusetts CPR, but it's mostly Boston area hospitals, although I don't think that there's anything inherent to that. As I reflect on it, quite honestly, it's a little bit of the social network, right? The folks who are at the Harvard CTSI and the folks at Tufts are my friends. We were fellows together, right? And so we emailed each other and now we're all collaborating. So probably we should take some of our own advice to heart and reach out and expand on that. I will say that the goal here is to have this be a resource. So, you don't need to have been on these calls that we've been having over the last 3 weeks to apply and get access to Specimen. I think that's one way to have the sort of infrastructure there on which to collaborate. And then actually having projects together requires fora like this and research and progress meetings and places that we think together instead of getting into our silos and trying to be first to a question. Because that's what I think lends to people starting to get defensive and sort of throwing up their walls and not working together. But thus far, this has been a very anxiety-provoking and stressful situation, especially if you're an infectious diseases doctor working at the hospital. But one thing that actually gives me a lot of hope and inspiration and kind of revives me when I'm feeling broken down is that there is this spirit of collaboration still, even across institutions that in the past have sometimes got a little guarded with each other. And it's really remarkable to see.
So I want to sort of build on that comment about sort of the social norms piece, because, and this is also building off a comment from Karen in our chat, which is that the community engagement cores of the CTSAs are really the people who sort of have put this community forum together. And you mentioned the importance of social norms, both in creating disparities and addressing disparities. And that's really what community engagement programs are meant to do, right? Bring together partners and create norms. And so I wonder, beyond forums like this, how might the community engagement program support people like you who are trying to build this kind of infrastructure?
I think so. One thing that is that's missing, honestly, still from all of our meetings is actually the community perspective. We have a lot of investigators who care about community and perspective, including myself, but we don't actually have someone who lives in the neighborhoods with the red dots that I showed before, who's coming to the meetings and talking to us about priorities. I think that it's important. It's particularly acute, I think, on some of the thorny ethical questions that can be raised around doing inpatient research in the COVID epidemic. And there have been ethical discussions that I think we need a community perspective there. And so that could be a fantastic thing. We had a meeting last week where we were talking about some ethical issues with trials and tried to bring a community representative from the IRB. It didn't work out for that meeting, but that, I think that with a more robust, if it wasn't just emailing one person and saying, can you come, right? It might have happened. And I think that's important. So I think trying to work to get community perspective into the questions that we're asking, so that it's not the same old people sitting around the table asking the same old questions would be wonderful.
Yeah. And I think the pace at which this has happened, if you don't have that infrastructure in place already to sort of dip into sort of that perspective and that resource, if it's not already convened, it's hard to pull together in a pandemic like this.
Yeah.
So it speaks to the importance of our community engagement programs and really sort of thinking about that, so that we have deep pockets of community perspective.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, that's a product of this meeting already. It never crossed my mind that the CTSI has this community forum and that might be the resource to go to. The CFAR has a CAB, maybe we can call someone, but this would be a much better way of thinking about community engagement.
Okay, I'm going to go to our chat here. I'm going to start up at the top. I might miss some things, but Peter Friedman mentioned that they had similar problems at Bay State Medical Center, but acknowledges that oncologists have long recognized the importance of clinical trials in sort of treatment planning. I wonder, did you have support from the cancer clinical trials offices and sort of infrastructure and thinking about sort of how to build this up so quickly?
Yep, absolutely. And Vishali, picture I showed, is an oncologist, and there are other trials opening from oncology. So the cancer trials unit absolutely contributed its expertise and its staff to making this happen, it is important to think about. And I think that's true in cancer care. For a long time, it's recognized that part of cancer care is clinical trials. So it shouldn't be such a foreign concept that part of COVID care might be clinical trials as well.
Great. There's another question about safety net hospitals here. Do most safety net hospitals have the kind of research infrastructure that BMC has? Is this issue important in thinking about access to trials at other safety net hospitals?
Yes, I think it's incredibly important because actually, as frustrating as that story was, BMC is an academic medical center. We do have a clinical trials office. There are faculty around who do clinical, right? So we're actually, relative to other safety nets, in much better condition. And I think that's really important to acknowledge because there is the BMC somewhere, in some rural area in some other state that doesn't have any of these things. And not only do they not have the clinical trials, right? The story did involve me talking to a colleague on the phone who was an executive vice president at a pharmaceutical firm. So it's not lost on me that actually in this case, it was the same old social network. It just happened to be working for us this time. I'm perfectly comfortable exploiting that social capital to help the patients of BMC, but it's not a national solution. I think we need national solutions that involve things like pharmaceutical companies being, in some way required to think about opening up trials at safety net hospitals, even if that means that those hospitals don't enroll as quickly as huge academic medical centers. And I think it also means that large academic medical centers should be thinking about how to open up satellite sites at affiliated rural and community hospitals and helping them to do these trials, because I think that's the right way to get it done. It's probably not to rebuild this infrastructure from scratch at a community hospital that's never done any research at all. But if we could build, if we did it through satellite sites, those centers would start having infrastructure and they might start to participate more directly in research, which would be a good thing for all of us.
Yeah, so that builds nicely on a comment by Ashish here. He sort of says, what part should the state and federal government play in all of this? And I think you highlighted nicely that policy around this is really important. And maybe that's a lesson for like a next step.
Yeah, I think so. I think there does need to be some policy about this. And I also think, like I said, and I do think it involves recognizing that providing equity in trials does not mean that you allow the safety net hospitals onto the field and then you say, well, you're not enrolling as fast as, Hospital X, which has been doing clinical trials for 50 years and has its $15 million research budget, right? It means basically working with those hospitals to help them come up to speed and understanding that not every hospital will be your top enroller. Some hospitals might enroll a little bit more slowly, but what they're providing is diversity in your patient base, and that's just as important as N, right? The total N is important, but so is the sort of distribution of who's in that N, and both those things have the same value and the same importance.
And the current reimbursement sort of structure for participating in trials, which is based on your recruitment, right, is a counter to that issue. And so I know of some examples at our institution where we weren't able to continue in trials because we weren't able to enroll, but there wasn't recognition that additional resources might be necessary to reach those populations.
Yeah, and the overhead of ironically, the overhead of doing the trial might be higher if you're if you've never done trials before, your cost of just getting the trial going is probably higher than a hospital that's done 1 million trials and they just plug it right in. And also you're getting fewer reimbursements because you're not enrolling as fast. Which it's a great example, right? You can understand from the company's perspective, it makes sense. We want to reimburse performance. We want to incentivize performance, and that's not invalid, but there has to be some balance to that. Otherwise you end up with the situation we're in.
All right, let me go back to our chat. There's recognition of the floor nurses and the importance that they play in sort of helping us, and we want to make sure we acknowledge them.
Yeah, I'll pause there. I want to acknowledge the floor nurses for sure who are sitting there going into rooms and really doing the work. I also want to acknowledge the food service people, the phlebotomists, the people who clean the hospital, because those are the folks that are, I was just in the hospital. I walked around and talked to people. And I actually, because of PPE shortage, was not asked to go into COVID rooms, but the phlebotomist was, right? And so I do think that's really important, that the people who get the parades and the honking are not necessarily the people always who are taking the greatest amount of risk.
Yeah, I think it's from a community engagement lens, it's really, making sure we're very clear on identifying who the key stakeholders are in the success of this approach.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm just looking at a comment from Karen here. She says, more explicitly about sort of the community perspective is, could we engage the community who've been affected by COVID so that patients who find themselves in a situation in which they could participate might be more open? In other words, those who've experienced it could help us inform and educate those who haven't yet participated. So maybe a future opportunity.
We've been thinking about patient materials that are more accessible, but that's even better, right? Like no matter how good your infographic is, it's not the same thing as talking to a human being who's been through it. So that would be amazing.
Okay, Howard asks the hospital staff, have we asked them? They are from the community. And I know that the nursing staff has been intimately involved in sort of creating these protocols at BMC. I don't know if other support staff across the hospital were involved in any of these protocols. They probably were involved in helping us, if we didn't get it right the first time, rethinking it, right?
Yeah, no, so I think that's a fair summary. And they absolutely have been involved in thinking about how we're actually going to do it, which is to say they're involved with the protocol, right? If you think about the prospective specimens protocol, at some level, the protocol is enroll people, go there and collect specimens on day 3, 6, 9, 12, right? What the protocol really is well, how's the phlebotomist going to know to go in the room? How's the nurse going to, right? And so they were absolutely involved. So we have representation from all those services in our sort of protocol development committee for these studies. And we've been doing education nurses so they're aware. And so, which has been great. And we've been going forward learning as well. Like I think at first we didn't fully appreciate how important it is to make sure the nurses are 100% on board. They understand what the medicines are. They understand what the adverse effects are, because that's what nurses do. And they're never going to administer medicine that they don't understand. So we quickly jumped to that, and we've been working with them, and I think it's been working.
There's a question about the NIH AIDS clinical trials group, that structure. Is that a possibility of developing a structure like that? Is that possible politically now?
Yeah, I think, well, I think in the short term, what's happening is that literally the NIH is using the AIDS clinical trials group as a COVID network. So to some extent, I think appropriately, NIH is sort of leveraging established trials networks. They're using the flu network, the AIDS network, they're using the HIV prevention network, probably others as well that I'm less familiar with, to do COVID research. And then I think we have to see where we end up in the epidemic. And perhaps it's hard to imagine right this minute establishing a new network like that, but maybe. I think that is the right model. And the question is really, should we leverage what's there now, or should we build something from scratch? We'd like to be involved with that. If there's going to be a COVID clinical trials network, BMC would like to be involved.
Great. Let's see. There's a comment about what we learned from Singapore, in that it was an example of they had a comprehensive successful approach in Singapore, but not necessarily reaching all marginalized populations, and there was a resurgence of infections when migrant workers in Singapore were not provided access to testing and early management. So, you know, perhaps a lens to what might happen in the future if other cities and states aren't mobilizing like we are here in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I think that's true. And in some ways we're sort of in our social silos and social class and discriminate, you know, and segregation, but not entirely, right? The virus will cross those lines. And we really are at some level all in this together. We've got to figure it out. There's no way that we can end this epidemic unless it needs to be ended across the board. Otherwise it's going to keep coming back. It's just a question of how long does it take?
Yeah, I mean, this makes me think of the discussion around the crisis standards of care, and there's been a lot of dialogue and sort of thinking about, you know, fortunately we didn't quite get there.
No, we did not.
But we came pretty close. And the current sort of iteration of the crisis standards of care are inherently, you know, set us up for disparities or disparate outcomes. And so, I don't know if any comments about that.
Well, I do think that it's a really good, like the crisis of care discussion is another example of that's the same disparities. It's just that COVID is sort of shining a bright light on them, right? So if you have a crisis standard that involves, you know, comorbidities and likelihood of prolonging life, you have huge disparities and who has cardiovascular disease and what the life expectancy is, then you're just propping those to your crisis standards of care. So, you know, that's one thing that it's disturbing and also fascinating, just how clear the disparities become because of COVID. I think, you know, at first it's shocking, and then you realize this is the same thing. We're just talking about it differently because it's so in our face. Like, we needed this to actually see it, but now we see it. You can't not see it. And I think the crisis standards is another example.
I'll just end with a final comment from someone in the chat around, you know, we have to acknowledge that building trust in the community is important, and acknowledge it's not just that this sort of crisis and this sort of time crunch, but it's actually the events that have happened historically over time that sort of, you know, put us in this situation. And hopefully, as you know, use the word silver lining a couple times in your discussion today, Ben, and I think that there are certainly some silver linings to learn from this, and hopefully help us address some, you know, the inertia that's been there and the issues that we know are there, but it's an opportunity for us to come together and address them. So I'm just gonna, looks like the questions have stopped and we're coming to the close of our hour. I wanna thank you for a really important discussion. I wanna thank you for your time. I wanna thank everyone at BU and BMC for all the amazing work that they're doing. Everyone on the call who I know are busy with many different things in their personal and professional lives that are affected by the COVID pandemic. But I think you'll all agree that this was a really important conversation and discussion. I want to acknowledge all of my colleagues across the other CTSA programs for initiating this community forum. I think we feel it's been an overwhelming success in sort of bringing us together as an academic community. We've certainly engaged a lot of key stakeholders. We want to make sure we engage our community stakeholders better in the future. So we'll welcome feedback from you on this forum. We want to thank you for your participation. I think if I share my screen, I just want to share with you my contact information. If there are any questions related to the talk today, you can direct them to us. We'll go through the chat once again, make sure that we address everyone's questions. If we didn't, we'll make sure we post them in a place on the BU BMC CTSI website. So any final thoughts, Ben?
Well, thank you for coming. It's really been a pleasure to present and for all the great questions, and good luck everyone with your work. Stay safe and we'll move forward together. Looking forward to hearing what comes out of it.
All right, thanks. Thanks everyone for joining. Be safe.